Hello and welcome to this event on realising the future of learning today. My name is Andrew Jack from the Financial Times, and over the next hour and a half, we're going to explore these key issues at a very challenging time: how to improve education, what challenges need to be filled, what are the best forms of response. So this event begins with a launch of 2 reports from the World Bank, and we're going to hear from some great speakers both within the bank, from external experts, and indeed from ministers and other leading international figures to get their perspectives. We'll also be trying to incorporate reflections and questions from those of you watching, so do please use the chat function to post your questions and we'll try to integrate them. We're going to begin with a short discussion with Mamta Murty, the Vice President of Human Development for the World Bank, and Magda Diop, the Vice President for Infrastructure at the bank. And then we'll go into a presentation initially of the 2 reports by Jaime Saavedra, the Global Director for Education, and then into our wider discussion. But let's begin with Mamta and Magda and talk a little bit about the context, where we are today, why education is so important, how to respond. Mamta, let's begin with you. So tell us a little bit about the stakes here in education currently and the risks that we currently have given the disruptions that are taking place in the era of COVID.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to all the distinguished panelists, guests, ministers, and hello to everyone who's listening online. The stakes are very high because even before the pandemic, the world was facing a learning crisis. So over half the children in developing countries were not able to read a simple text, read and comprehend a simple text by the age of 10. So this was the situation even before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, we know that schools have closed and children have had to learn remotely. And very often in developing countries, the poorest children do not have access to the internet, which has typically been the means through which education has been conveyed during the lockdown. So we face a situation where half the world's children could not read a simple text, and we could go to a situation based on simulations that we've done in which an additional 70 million children could be in learning poverty, by which we mean an additional 70 million children could face a situation where they can't read and comprehend a simple text by the age of 10. This is likely to have a huge impact on the opportunities that they face in their lifetime. And we're particularly concerned because the children who are likely to be affected are the most vulnerable. They are poor, they are marginalized, they could be refugees, they could have disabilities. So not only is the future potential of these children affected, which will have a huge impact on the societies that they live in, it can also contribute further to inequality, which is something that has already been exacerbated by the pandemic. So it's a very serious situation that affects the potential of these children, the societies that they live in, and the broader societal issues around inequality.
Thanks. So Magda, in your role focused on infrastructure, give us a sense of how important that is in building human capital and what to do, particularly in this current crisis, to try to close that digital divide that we were just hearing about from Mamta.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody, the ministers, colleagues, and the participants. I mean, let's go back before the crisis. Wonderful thing actually happened with technology. Actually, think people have been able to do a lot of innovation in education, personalized learning. Now people can take a computer, take the data that a student have, zero on it, and tailor the program and the type of learning they need. With IoT, the way we learn science, where we're sitting in a lab, we're seeing some graphs when we are kids, we change. People can use IoT now in a classroom and demonstrate in practice what it means, because the technology will allow us to do that. We had open sources. When we were a young student, At our time, I remember the faculty in my country were given a stipend to go and travel to developed country to be able to access a library and do their own research. Today, you have open source, you have access, you can have access to education. So technology helped a lot on education, particularly on higher education. But at the same time, we have seen two worlds being developed. People, the have and the have not. And the have and the have not are not only in developing countries and most developed countries, but within developed countries, you have seen huge differences, and inequality has been exacerbated. So today, working towards increasing access, making it more affordable, is not only an issue of that we need to look in general and looking at averages, but you need to look at distribution. So poverty and access to digital is very, very clear. Let me make a last point. Health sector has been important progress in terms of diagnostic today using technology. AI is used today for imaging. AI is used for diagnostic. And I can see a lot of this being replicated in the education sphere, where people will be able to monitor in real time the progress made by students by being able to tailor the content that is given to students, which is exactly what the report that Jaime, many years ago, and his colleague were working when we were talking about the classroom in Brazil, where there are a lot of factors that were impacting the outcome in terms of education that were just going beyond the simple and mere presence of the educator in the classroom. So I just want to say that for us, we are doing all this in infrastructure, all this in connectivity to improve people's life and help them to see the future differently. We are at a time where for the first time of generations, we are looking the world differently from the previous generation. The world is bigger for them. So this access to technology will allow people to leapfrog and to be able to get the opportunities that they didn't have in the past.
Thanks. So Mamta, you talked about the risks to education, the risk of learning loss. So what do we need to do to reinvent education to make it more equitable, and what's the bank's role going to be in this?
Thank you, Andrew, for that question. Let me build upon what my colleague Maktar just said. There's a lot that needs to be done, and actually the fact that children are at home and are not learning has actually been a wake-up call to many governments. Things like learning from home, which were a nice to have now become a must-have. And countries are taking a number of steps, and we, along with other partners, are assisting them. To start with, when schools shut down, there was a huge attempt to help kids learn from home. And this involved TV, this involved radio, this involved printed materials. And to some extent, it involved the internet, because many school systems and many households are really not set up for children to learn from home via the internet. In the second phase, if you like, now that schools are reopening and children are coming back, there needs to be a big attempt to help them come back to school, which means that curricula need to be modified. We're not going to be in a situation where the entire curriculum can be completed, the annual curriculum, because schools have been shut down for a period of time. And countries are prioritizing foundational skills that children need to learn in the remainder of the school year. Teachers need to learn to teach differently, because they have to figure out what is it that kids don't know, what have they missed out on by being at home, and they have to help kids make up for what they've missed out. And actually very practical teacher training to help teachers teach in this way is something that countries are working on. And I'm thinking in particular of the work we're doing in Pakistan, which is helping the government work in that direction. In addition to that, assessment systems need to change, because because school systems need to figure out what is it that children have forgotten, and then monitor what they're learning as they come back to school. And we have some work going on in Kenya, helping reform assessment systems so that they can function in this way. In addition, being at home, children have suffered from mental health issues. There are nutritional issues, and many school systems, as children are coming back, are focusing on complementing things in this area as well. Countries are also taking the opportunity to reimagine the school system and reimagine learning, and this means really integrating the new technologies that Maktar was talking about, integrating that into the curriculum so that it builds the foundational skills, and that would include digital skills that children need. It focuses on a range of materials, they're focusing on providing a range of materials, digital content via the web, mobile content, which can be accessed at all times by students. And they're focusing on making sure that teachers are able to deliver this kind of learning. The best example I can think of is Turkey, where we are assisting the government in going to scale in reimagining the school system so that it functions in this blended way, so that there is learning from both home and in school, and students who would typically have been marginalized or left out are included. The other example I'd like to give is that the work we're doing in the Edo state of Nigeria under the strong stewardship of the governor, where there is a real attempt to reimagine school and work with parents and teachers and children in using blended learning of different forms. So in a nutshell, I think school systems need to be prepared to receive children back and remediate all the learning that has been lost during the time that children have been out of school, and also take this opportunity to reimagine what school can deliver through technology that assists teachers in providing foundational skills to children. And we're very happy to be partnering with a number of countries to do this. Finally, this is the context in which governments are likely to be very strapped for resources because of the pandemic-induced contraction in many economies. So it's very important for governments to think of smart investments. And that's why we have constituted the Education Evidence Advisory Panel in collaboration with the UK's FCDO. And the purpose of this is really to bring together the best evidence in the world about what is a smart investment and is likely to pay back, and to make sure that countries are learning from each other about these investments so that they can make smart investments that pay back.
And to be clear, the bank's role in this is both providing technical advice, but also additional financing opportunities?
Absolutely. We see ourselves as the knowledge bank. So we do both. In a way, it's our blended contribution. We blend knowledge and financing, even as we support blended learning in countries.
And Maktar, just following up on that, then we've talked about education, but also beyond the education sector directly. What scope is there for solutions, and how's the bank trying to support those?
I would like to really support a very strong point made by Mamta, which is blended. And I think the blended will be everywhere, blended services. I'm taking it from a health specialist who says that the future will be social, mobile, analytics, and cloud. And I think that applies also to education. Without the physical interaction with the teacher, we know that we cannot have quality of education. But how the analytics that we have, all the data that we are able to collect today, how the mobile tools that we have today, how the concentration of that knowledge in the cloud and make it accessible to everybody can be used to improve the productivity of teachers. In a sense, what we would like to do, I believe, is to remove all the tasks that the machine can do from the teacher and let the teacher focus on what the machine can do for the student. And there is a lot of this which is necessary. emotional skill, and a lot of skills that are needed. And this is the same evolution that we are seeing in health and in a lot of sectors. So I do believe that in all the human development sector, we will have that evolution towards much more blending between the human side and the machine. There is no other better place where natural language processing, machine learning can be used better than in education. So just think about today how we are learning spelling and grammar. The way we are learning grammar and spelling was our teacher was writing on with a chalk on the board a certain number of rules that we have to memorize. Today is our software. When you write, we are correcting you as you go. And by correcting you in real time, they help you actually to learn much faster those rules. This is a type of things that I'm seeing a little bit in the future, and which will be very useful for developing countries, because you can make you can leapfrog and improve the productivity of teachers. Jaime has been always telling us there is a huge deficit of teachers in developing countries, and those countries are facing also fiscal constraints. So how technology can help addressing that issue by reducing reducing the cost linked to having more teachers by using technology. This is something that you might want to think how to increase the productivity of teachers by using technology in developing countries. We have also the issue of bandwidth access. When we talk to access education services, you need more than 25K kilobits per second in a country on average. And that's what we have in Africa. So one of the things that we are doing right now, working in the Broadband Commission, which is chaired by President Kagame, is to increase access of broadband, but also to be able to, working with UNESCO and our colleague from HD, to have a very aggressive program to connect our school to broadband services. Those are very practical things that will, to our view, help a lot in terms of improving services. Lastly, learning is often mobile now. You need to have a handset to learn. Our children are spending more time looking at their mobile phone when they want to Google and search for information than maybe going to their laptop or to their desktop. Desktop doesn't exist even for them anymore. So reducing the cost of these mobile devices would be essential also in the process of improving education outcome in developing countries.
Okay, so Maktar and Mamta, thanks very much for those introductory comments. I think the issues you raise, and you hopefully will continue to be here for the panel discussion later. But it's time now to move to Jaime Saavedra, the Global Director of Education at the World Bank, who's going to frame our discussion by presenting the two key reports that the bank is just launching. Jaime, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm trying to share my screen now. Hopefully it's working. Thank you very much. So look, I will try to quickly try to summarize a few of the key messages of these two reports, but just to emphasize and putting things in context that as Mamta was already summarizing, we're living the worst crisis in education of the last 100 years. We've never seen this extent of school closures, plus the worst economic crisis since the war. She summarized well all the challenges that we have in terms of potential dropout rates, foregone earnings, mental health, inequality, and as she was saying. Before the crisis, we were already living a learning crisis. We had a number of learning poverty that it was 53%, right, of children who could not read and understand a simple text by age 10. That was already a huge crisis, right? This number, remember, this number should be zero, in the same way that hunger or extreme poverty should be zero. And unfortunately, we're seeing that this number might rise to 63%. So more than 70 million children might be joined in the ranks of the learning poor. The needs then and the urgency to build better systems to bring the learning of the future to today is even more urgent than before. Now, but we can do that if we build on some of the lessons that this pandemic is leaving us. And Magda already mentioned one critical lesson, which is that we need to close the digital divide. And this is not about just closing the gap regarding connectivity devices and software. This is about enhancing the human connections. Is at the end of the day is about empowering teachers, and actually the art of bringing the future to today is going to be to hit that right balance between technology and the human factor. The second key lesson of this pandemic is that education is a social phenomenon, right? The schools are the one of the main instruments that societies have in order to equalize opportunity and give all students the opportunities that they need and the skills for life that they need. And education and the school is a social space. At the end of the day, education and learning is about that magic of interaction, magical interaction between the teacher and the students, right? And the relationship with his peers. So this can be complemented by a remote learning, yes, but presential education can never be replaced. And finally, the other key lesson of this pandemic is that we need to have resilient systems. There has to be a continuity of the education process between the school and the home, and that implies that then through public policy, we also need to worry not only what's happening in school, but also to put the right conditions at home. Connectivity, but we need to make sure that children have books and reading material at home. And finally, parents and communities are key players. And again, public policy should be there in order to support parents so they can be better enablers of the education process of their children. Countries now have the opportunity to build the foundations of the future of learning. But what we propose as a vision is that using the science of learning, that learning happens with joy, with purpose, and rigor. The joy of learning comes when the learner's skills are stretched and the tasks are challenging, but are not impossible. Learners will see purpose when what is being taught is something that's relevant, that is important, that is applicable. And then finally, learning has to happen with rigor, because if we strive for excellence and mastery, deliberate practice is essential. So we need joy, we need the fun, but we need the effort as well in the education process. This needs to happen for everyone, right? In this statement, that sounds kind of obvious, but obviously it's not happening, right? We see that more than half of kids are not learning, even if they are not in school. So I mean, the statement of everyone is each time more important. It has to happen everywhere because systems have to be resilient. In this vision, what we see is that successful systems, right, require that learners have to be prepared and empowered to learn. Teaching has to be a socially valued career. Learning resources have to be adequate and diverse so that each child can receive the stimulation and the support that he needs, because each child within each classroom, right, has a different pace of learning. School environments have to be safe. Anything that we do on pedagogics, on teaching, will be rendered irrelevant, right, if the school is not a safe place for the child to thrive. And then and finally, the education systems are extremely large and difficult systems to be managed, and the school is a very tough institution. And the picture that you see of this principal in Sierra Leone just tells us that we really need to invest in giving principals the tools that they need in order to be successful leaders. This vision has to be translated into country policy actions. And actually the report goes, and this basically what you see here summarizes, right, all the policy actions that we see, or is a sample of policy actions that we see are critical in these 5 areas. When we talk about learners, I mean, we need to continue investing much more into nutrition, stimulation, and care in the early years, and we need to empower parents. Teachers is the one that I want to spend a few seconds. Teaching has to be a meritocratic career where politics have no role in selecting who is a teacher or who is a principal. We will see success when the perception of society is that teaching is a demanding and valued career. That is one of the most essential endeavors that we have in education policy reform. And finally, we need to train the 60 million teachers that are today in the classroom, but that training has to be practical and has to be about improving the quality of the interaction between the teacher and the students. When we talk about learning resources, is that there has to be a curriculum, but not to be covered, right, religiously. The curriculum is a tool that can support teachers to make sure that they cover what each one of the students need. And actually, and this is something that probably Karthik is going to be emphasizing, we need to make sure that teachers have the tools to teach at the right level, to teach each student at the level that he needs in order to make progress. We need books. We need to have learning resources, right, in each of school and in each home. And schools, and this is something that we need to really need to be advocates. The schools have to be free of any type of violence: physical violence, gender-based violence, sexual violence, psychological violence. Unfortunately, that is something that we still see too much in our school systems, and we really need to push much more aggressively in solving that issue. We need to increase the quality of the education of children with disabilities, and something that really hampers the education process in many countries is that we're not teaching children in their mother tongue, right? And that shift is essential. It's something that is happening, but has to continue. And actually, many countries do not recognize that there has to be a career path for principals and give them the tools to be successful, successful pedagogical leaders at their school. The investment on high quality bureaucracies in the education systems is absolutely essential if we want to have sustainable reforms. Technology cuts across everything. Technology is about empowering teachers, about personalizing learning. Technology is what will allow us to do things at scale, connecting learners everywhere. And it could be a game changer in terms of managing the system better. Let me close with 5 principles of what we see are critical for education reform, and in order to move to the learning of the future that we envision for all countries. First is investing in smartly in technology, which we have summarized and several of us have mentioned. But second, successful systems in which learning levels are high are in all cases systems that focus relentlessly on equity, and they move towards the progressive path towards universalism. All successful systems have a focus on results and base the policy on evidence. And finally, all successful systems, there is a good understanding of what are the financial commitments that are needed, not today. What's the path of financing that a country needs for the next 10 years if you want to reduce learning poverty or eliminate learning poverty? Many of these reforms are complicated and are risky, and many of these reforms required several governments, one after the other, right, to continue pursuing these reforms. So political commitment is absolutely essential if we want to strive for a better education for our kids. The future of learning starts today with a visionary and bold actions, and it's really urgent. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Jaime, for kicking off then this discussion. So we're now going to move into a panel reflection. And with us today, we have 3 ministers as well as 2 other experts to bring different perspectives. So Dr. Tarek Galal Shorki, the Minister of Education for the Arab Republic of Egypt, Montserrat Cremer, Minister of Education for Ecuador, and Paula Ingabire, the Minister of ICT for Rwanda. And we'll also hear from Victoria Collis, the Managing Director of the EdTech Hub, and Karthik Muralidharan, Professor of Economics at the UC of San Diego and the Global Co-Chair of Education at JPEL. But let's begin with the country perspective, and very keen to hear the views of the 3 ministers that we have with us today a little bit on the context that they're dealing with pre and indeed during COVID, and how they reflect and react on this bank's reflections and strategy. And let me begin with you, Dr. Tarek, from Egypt. I mean, I think obviously you were already beginning to look at education reform reforms even ahead of the immediate disruption that COVID has caused. Tell us a little bit about that reflection and how you've been approaching it.
Well, thank you. And yes, this is true. We have started reimagining our education system back in 2017. And we actually worked closely with the bank and with many other partners. And just way before COVID-19 hit us, we were putting together a totally new education system. We deployed it in 2018 for the early childhood years, KG1, KG2, and first grade. Now, as we speak, it reached third grade. But parallel to that, we invested in changing our assessment in high schools, and we integrated technology heavily for our high school students. We started deploying that on grade 10.
Minister? I think because we're having a bit of trouble.
You hear me, right?
Oh, that's better now. Thank you. We lost you, I'm sorry, for the last minute or so. If you want to just briefly summarize again, apologies, the connection's a bit bad.
Voice window. Do you hear me well?
It's going in and out. Try again now, and if not, perhaps we'll come to somebody else and then come back to you. Did you want to turn off your video, Minister? Turn off your video. I think we're okay. I think we better perhaps I don't know if technical colleagues might try and get the Minister to call back in. Because apologies, we're just losing the sound. Let me, and then we'll come back to you in a couple of minutes, but let's perhaps move, if I may, then to the Minister from Ecuador, Montserrat Crema, just to get a sense really of your focus that you've already been developing for a while, I think, on quality learning and how to access the most marginalized. Tell us a little bit about the origins of that policy and what the key elements of it have been, Minister Crema.
Thank you very much, and sorry because I can't join by video. Good morning or good evening to everybody, and thank you to the World Bank for this opportunity and for all your support. Well, Ecuadorian education system has 4.5 million of students. 75% belongs to public education. 7% of our child population belong to early childhood. This student group is one of the most affected by the pandemic, and just like the 23% of high school students. On the other hand, despite the crisis, we offer school breakfast to approximately 2.5 million of children, and also textbooks and uniforms in order to facilitate access to school. Therefore, we work a lot with the family and the community, even more considering that we have approximately 2,000 rural schools with 1 or 2 teachers and 6,000 rural schools. So the curriculum is flexible and must be contextualized according to the students' needs and cultural characteristics. But the big challenge is that, according to the World Bank, in Ecuador, years of schooling adjusted for the quality of learning could fall by up to 10%. And the learning poverty indicator could be affected, considering that before COVID-19, and according to the World Bank, 63% of children in Ecuador at the late primary age today are not proficient in reading and adjusted for the out-of-school children. This year, we have almost 300,000 children more in the public system in early childhood and primary school because they entered the system and by transfer from private to public education during the crisis. Therefore, a diagnostic evaluation of learning and psycho-emotional is essential for a leveling and differentiated pedagogical support. For Ecuador, the challenge implies to contribute to the real possibilities for transformation of learning and the school into a space of integral development. Since March, schools are closed, like we know, in the whole planet. And we had 3 objectives to continue. First, psycho-emotional support focused on prevention of violence. Second, guarantee access to learning and reinforce school retention with an emphasis in students and families living in poverty. And third, the continuity of the educational process in different and optional scenarios. The challenge is to understand that more important than connectivity is the connection with loved ones and family. In this sense, each home has a teacher who communicates with the family to support learning and emotional health or violence issues. Everyone knows that we are together, and this is why we have been able to reach the 9th month of isolation in the educational model called We Learn Together at Home. Therefore, to face the great challenge of closing gaps of educational inequality and inclusion, I'm finishing, we have made the system more flexible. And for this, it was necessary to change regulations and agreements with all sectors of society. We also gave importance to the teachers, offering job stability, professional development, and reducing an administrative job. Through dialogue, difficult work circumstance caused by the economic crisis were overcome. Thank you.
And tell us a bit more about the non-traditional models of education that you've been using during the pandemic, and maybe things that other countries can learn from that.
Yes, right now we are talking about the progressive return to classes. We have an educational continuity plan that offers greater autonomy and responsibility to schools according to their needs, starting with water, sanitation, and hygiene, because wash and also nutrition as a multidimensional aspect are essential to improve the indicator of learning poverty in Ecuador. But on the other hand, now with the economic crisis and COVID-19, the education budget was strongly affected, so it is urgent to review investment in and the quality of education spending. So we focus on the priority needs of the population, such as the provision of school meals or the delivery of tablets, but prioritizing the student population and with the necessary interaction and evaluation of the use of technology and devices to access connectivity to close the gaps. We also are, to strengthen school permanence and improve learning, we have carried out an approach with 4 components: academic, teaching, emotional, and active search. All this supported by a communication strategy. In academic components, we are working with a system for monitoring and supporting educational management to offer support to managers and motivation to teachers. We are implementing acceleration and leveling learning programs for students from 8 to 18 years old. It is based on multi-grade strategies with different levels of complexity according to the characteristics of the group of students. We are reactivating technical education with self-sustaining management and a dual component to strengthen technical training in skills that facilitates job placement. We also have teachers for pedagogical support with 5 priorities: detection, awareness, advice, intervention, monitoring, and accompaniment of students with special educational needs associated with disabilities. We reinforce the diagnosis to provide feedback on those skills, mainly of reading, writing, and math. And we implement different forms of differentiated evaluation through the student portfolio and interdisciplinary projects with their feedback strategies. We develop teacher training for the implementation of the prioritized curriculum and for the progressive, voluntary, and safe return to school phase, and with emphasis on psychosocial support and self-care. also a platform for volunteer professionals and students who carry out their pre-professional internships. An emotional component, we also have programs of peer support networks through meetings of teachers and student participation with the strategies based on their experiences, national communication campaign to sensitize the entire educational community, special brigades for emotional support to members of the educational community. And we have a program of active search component, which with the interinstitutional system for reporting students outside the educational system. Remember that in Ecuador, we are in elections process of a new government. So we are trying to define with national agreements an educational agenda necessary to consolidate long-term educational policies with continuity and sustainability.
Okay, thanks very much. I think is Dr. Tarek, is he back online? Could you hear us? Do you want to join us again? Possibly without your video, but thanks very much. You managed to reconnect.
If you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. So thanks for that. So just sorry, because we had to obviously disconnect in the middle of that, but just set the scene for us a little bit in terms of the political commitment today in Egypt and how significant that is in trying to drive educational reforms.
Well, our experience is that the political commitment is really, really essential in pulling off something as big as we are trying to do in Egypt, changing the mindsets of almost the entire population of parents and their children, dismantling the old education system, replacing it by skills-driven system rather than credentially-driven system, needed really heavy support from the political leadership. You know, those things create unrest and worry at massive numbers of people. The number of students and teachers in Egypt is almost 25% of the population. So if you add the parents to that mix, you're talking about 75% of the population. So without the president's support in Egypt, personally, we couldn't have pulled it off. And what I was trying to say before the sound was cut off is that our biggest challenge is really not we have the technology, we are fully prepared for fully online learning if we have to, but that wasn't really the difficult part. The difficult part remains to be changing people's view on why do they send their children to school. Is it to really gain skills or to worry about an exam? We want the exam language to disappear in favor of skills and learning, but that is an uphill battle. COVID-19 helped us in some aspects and really didn't help us in others. It helped us accelerate people's acceptance of technology and online learning and so on. But we are trying to change people's attitude, parents and students, from being passive in the learning process to being active players. They used to be passive players, students, of course. Now, to COVID-19 forced on everyone to be active in seeking learning. That is not uniform across the board. And what we are facing is the panic of the caused by the epidemic and by the fact we ask people to go to school, but yet they try to stay home and get away with it. So they just want to pass the assessment as well. And we are really at a bind here because we lost a bit of the learning content last year. We cannot afford to do that 2 years in a row. We will have a major problem with this generation not finishing the requirements, yet they go to the school year, to the next school year without learning. And that is really tough to handle. So we are trying one way or another to complete the content they have to learn one way or another and to assess them properly. We tried all kinds of assessment from home but people really resort to cheating and getting away. This is where we are.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and we'll certainly come back to you in the discussion. But I'm keen briefly to introduce our other speakers as well. Could I turn now to Paula Ingabire in Rwanda? Tell us a little bit more about the role that you've been giving to online, to digitalization for kind of boosting uptake, which has been presumably accelerated during COVID.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think maybe just to respond to that question, I'll give a bit of a context. And just like the previous two ministers that spoke, I think what you see is that with the pandemic, we see a disruption that is coming in to affect already fragile education systems. And so it hasn't been easy at all, but it's also about how quickly governments, the private sector alike can mobilize the different resources they had to really respond to this disruption that was being caused mainly to the education sector. But I think for Rwanda, what also helped in many ways were some of the investments that we had already, that were already in the pipeline and were already being made by government. And so this blended learning approach that we've been talking about on this panel this morning is something that we had already started, a journey we had started where we were equipping every school with at least 2 smart classrooms. Of course, the intention was that with resources available, we should be able to scale up and ensure that every classroom is really transformed into a smart classroom where they're using digital tools and technologies and all the content is digitized and just enabling that. But because that wasn't possible to do it at scale, we started with 2 classrooms per school. However, there were still challenges. And I think many of these challenges and also inadequacies were really heavily exposed by the pandemic, whether it was access to the internet or even learning material, but also the teacher capacity to really operate in a blended learning environment that we sought to create for our student population. And most importantly, of course, challenges around bridging the digital divide that were not just specific to the education sector, but really across the board to say, how do we enable equal, inclusive access to all Rwandans when it comes to the different services that government is providing. But back to your question very specifically, I think hit with the pandemic, school closures happening, what we had to do is to say, how do we maintain a certain level of learning, may not be to the level at which it was, pre the COVID-19 pandemic. And so one of it was to work with the different telecom operators to say, can you zero rate some of these e-learning platforms that we have in place to enable access to content for students while they're at home. But of course, being mindful that certain students or certain families did not have the right devices and tools, we also had to have a complementary approach of how do we provide learning through radio and TV. So a multimodal, kind of like channels that would enable at least everyone to be able to learn at some point. And so these were some of the things that we were putting in place. But what we also did was to say, seeing that the pandemic is with us for some time, school closure happened for about 8 months, what could we do? So that when school resumes, we're in a better off position. So one, we invested in rolling out massive classrooms. We put in investments to have an additional over 22,000 classrooms, because it was important that you also have a small size. It also contributes to student pressure, but also to ensure that they are also learning in a very personalized manner. Then the other thing was to say, for those 8 months, the teachers are still home. Can we train them, whether it's in pedagogical training, whether it's in computer literacy, language proficiency? So when school actually resumes, they are better off than when we were hit by the pandemic. And the last 2 things, of course, that we're doing was testing and recruitments. Our teacher-student ratio is still very high. And so how do we lower that ratio? Because it also contributes to quality, education, but also personalized learning. And now we are doing massive investments in really making sure that we are digitizing the content as much as possible. And we're definitely thankful to the World Bank, because they've been a very great partner, even thinking through all these aspects of digitizing content, making sure school connectivity can be achieved in an equitable and inclusive manner, making sure devices can be available, and training teachers. And I think a few years of these investments will really put us at a better place than we are today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We've got a few questions for the minister, so perhaps I'll just come to those briefly first, and then we'll move into some of our other panelists. But there's one here, perhaps for you, about Rwanda. So as a country with limited resources, how are you investing in education technology to get as much leverage as possible?
So I think I did speak to that as well. I think part of how we're investing is really, we're looking at different ways, whether it's through blended financing models, because what we're looking at is the infrastructure bit, there's the devices, there's the content, there's the training of teachers. Of course, what we're also transitioning towards more is having a teacher-first approach, because once they have the tools, once they have the skills, then they're able to be able to impart and transfer that knowledge to the students. But also there's also understanding that beyond the classroom experience, and I think we did speak, many of the speakers spoke to that around learning poverty, knowing that the classroom experience will not be enough to bridge this learning poverty that we're seeing. So how do we empower parents? How do we empower communities to sort of like support and complement what is already happening? And I think that brings me to the next part, which is really around EdTech innovations that are going to improve literacy levels, that are going to improve, the ability to read and comprehension. And so if we're able to do that, but also think about empowering parents and communities to be able to complement what's going on there, then that will support. The other thing that we're looking at is investing in data-driven, management information systems that allow us to really track teacher attendance, student attendance. What are they learning? We've just entered into a partnership with one of the private players where what they're going to do is to have a curated content for us, so that any teacher across the country, if they're teaching math for grade 3, we know at any day in a particular day, all students that are learning math are learning the same thing. So one, you're relieving the burden from the teacher to do the preparation and everything, but rather to focus on how am I better prepared to deliver on the content of the class today and the days to come. And so all these are investments that we are making, investments that obviously with government resources will never be able to reach the scale that we would love to. And so what we're doing is really leveraging partners like the World Bank and and other development partners to say, this is the gap, this is the financing gap that we have. And so how do we mobilize the much required resources to sort of do that, but also to track the impact that is happening over time. And so these are some of the measures that we're putting in place and some of the educational reforms that are happening here in Rwanda.
Okay, very briefly, perhaps to Dr. Tarek in Egypt, there's a question about how is the government working with teachers to have them accept the reforms being implemented, and in particularly adopting technology in their teaching?
Well, that's a very good question. We are battling with that. We are making many steps. We actually here comes the political support again. We actually gave a financial raise to all teachers recently to cope with the pandemic across the country. Changed the law to raise their salaries, number one. Number two, we are engaging teachers in doing in-school teacher supplementary efforts they can charge some fees for, so they feel that their income is improved while they learn how to do new things. And we are engaging them in recording TV lessons and video on demand lessons for good compensation. We train them to do that. So we play carrot and stick here, and they join the new wave since the pandemic is going to be with us for a while. So far, it looks good. They are reacting very well in managing virtual classrooms, managing digital libraries. We have a program called Ask Your Teacher, which is an online, something like Uber for education, that teachers are competing to help students online for small fees, but with the large scale we have, it really becomes lucrative to many of them. So they really are incentivized to be trained and to offer services in this new environment.
Okay, thanks very much. And I'm sure we'll come back to our ministers in a little bit more for some questions a bit later. But let me now turn to Victoria Collis, the Managing Director of the EdTech Hub. So Victoria, maybe you want to tell us just a little bit what the Hub is and the areas of demand for use of what it's providing.
Yes, of course. The EdTech Hub is a global research partnership supported by the World Bank, along with UK Aid and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We do a number of different things, including running quite a big research program ourselves, a mix of commissions and our own research into various aspects of EdTech, but we also run a number of other facilities, including a help desk, which is available to World Bank teams and FCDO teams working with governments in around 70 low and middle income countries at the moment. Our mission is really to increase the availability of high quality data and evidence on EdTech and how it can be used effectively to improve teaching and learning, and also the management of education systems, and also as part of that to make sure that that evidence is disseminated increasingly widely.
And so give us a bit of a sense of where the real demand is coming from. What sort of areas, insights are
sure.
systems drawing on?
So, I mean, unsurprisingly, demand for new knowledge on EdTech this year has been significantly shaped by the unique challenges of keeping education delivery going during a global pandemic. By far, the most common type of request for information we've received in 2020 has been around using EdTech to provide remote learning while schools are closed. Having said that, as the initial shock and the accompanying adrenaline rush has died down a little bit, we're starting to find that more people we talk to are thinking about EdTech in a longer term and a rather more rounded way. So increasingly hot topics based on the queries we receive include things like how to use EdTech to transform teacher professional development. And it's been really great to see that, because that really focuses on that third principle of empowering teachers through technology that Jaime highlighted as one of those 5 principles in the World Bank paper that we're here to launch today. We're also starting to see a bit more of a focus on working with what's already available to people. So things like open education resources, gathering those in and curating them and fitting them to different education systems. This really includes a growing and really welcome appreciation of the benefits of shaping EdTech interventions on the basis of the operating realities in low and middle income countries. So, for example, as the minister from Rwanda has already mentioned, by thinking about radio, TV, and mobile, rather than simply concentrating on approaches that depend on people having universally high quality connectivity and access to more expensive devices. But having said that, even with more readily available technologies, we do need to keep thinking about what is really within people's reach. So, for example, the cost of a gigabyte of mobile data ranges from something like 9 cents in India to over $27 in Malawi. So we spend quite a lot of time advising people on the fact that, you know, not one size fits all in dealing with these issues.
So there's the infrastructure and the cost issues, as it were. Just in terms of the content, any particular kind of bright spots, you know, you might pick from some of the multiple areas. So actually the learning applications of tech for students, but also, as you were saying, the sort of backbone support for teachers, and perhaps the third area, the leadership and administration more generally. What are good
Absolutely.
practices or interesting applications that you've seen?
Absolutely. We have fielded a lot of calls to our help desk this year, the help desk that I mentioned earlier. And it's probably most useful to think of this as a resource for people who are a bit too time constrained personally to work through the evidence and research in detail. And we have handled about 50 inquiries that have covered a vast range of topics related to EdTech. But recently we took a look at those requests in relation to the recently published Smart Buys paper that Mamta referenced earlier in the meeting on cost-effective investments for improving learning in low and middle income countries. And we're really encouraged to see that already 1 in 4 of our help desk queries is directly linked to one or more of the Smart Buys. So, you know, we're finding, for example, lots of queries on things like how to shape teacher training. We're seeing increasing numbers of queries from people wanting to look at how to use data to monitor what is going on in schools. So as I said before, people are really starting to think beyond the initial challenges of just keeping the basics going.
Okay, and I mean, obviously, it's a huge challenge for governments trying to adapt to these kind of longer term trends in technology, but then also the massive disruption of coronavirus, of course, in so many different ways. I mean, what sort of advice do you give people trying to sort of balance and prioritize between longer term systemic change and the opportunities potentially of disruption of COVID longer term?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting one, because from my perspective, there's certainly promise as well as peril for the future of education coming out of this situation we found ourselves in. You know, massively disruptive events like the ones we've experienced this year do force us to think differently, even in a situation where the complexity of running something like a public education system means that important issues sometimes get consigned to the sort of too hard to handle box. Now, it's clear that government's first duty in this situation needs to be to find a way to deliver education at least as well as they were doing before the pandemic. And we've heard a lot about that from the ministers who are with us today. But we've also seen this year that governments are starting to experiment in really interesting ways with new ideas. You know, the history of EdTech is littered with some failed experiments, and those are often the ones that have privileged the tech over the ed and have focused, for example, on hardware or coding rather than how to use technology as a tool for teaching and learning or for managing a system. But we're starting to see people being nudged in some promising directions, things like using machine learning technology to really start making personalized learning a reality for more students, to building more tech-based solutions to address some of those really persistent system issues that we face, such as how you match what teachers would prefer in a posting to what the system actually needs.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. Let's now turn to Kartik. You've been researching technology and education policy and different approaches around the world for a long time. Give us a bit of a sense of your reflections on the reports that we've been hearing presented by Jaime today, but also more generally this huge variance in learning outcomes around the world as you see it.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me there?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So thanks to the World Bank, and it's been wonderful coming last because I can kind of because there's so much to say in terms of the research and the evidence, and I get to calibrate based on what's been said. So I fully agree with almost all the comments heard so far, and so let me just focus as kind of on the research, right, and say much as we're also excited about the potential of EdTech, I think what every education minister needs to know is just how much variation there is in the effectiveness of different technology interventions. So, and on the surface, EdTech seems like one big umbrella category. But if you look at the data, there are studies that show interventions with large positive effects, with zero effects, and even with negative effects. Okay, and so the moral of the story here is that the details really, really matter. Okay, so, and my main concern in terms of policy in the EdTech space is that for political leaders and policymakers, the focus tends to be much more on the hardware and the procurement, right? Which is, how do I get the broadband? How do I get the devices? But if you look at the evidence and projects as high profile as one laptop per child, you basically got zero impact on learning outcomes. Okay. And this is a flagship program. Everybody's excited. You think technology is going to transform learning. Zero impacts, okay? A high-quality study in Romania of providing computers to kids in middle secondary school found negative effects on learning, okay? And that's because you get the computers and kids are happy playing games, and that's kind of, distracting from work. A more recent study done by a student of mine who graduated from the Harvard Education School, in fact, looked at a smart classroom intervention in India. And again, this looked really promising on paper, and new devices, new teaching, and that again seems to find modest negative effects. Okay, so the challenge here is that integrating technology with pedagogy is really, really hard. And I think everybody here has been saying the right thing, which is important, and I'm glad to hear that. But I think the 2 points I want to highlight are A, that the integration with technology really, really matters, and B, we need continuous and ongoing evaluation and monitoring, because sitting in a conference room, if I was to evaluate different models looked on based on how glossy and exciting the PowerPoint looks, you'll get them wrong half the time, okay? And so you're going to need continuous measurement and evaluation and continuous iteration to see what are the models that are working. Now, on the more optimistic side, so Andrew, if I can go over a little bit, on the more optimistic side, we're also seeing studies that find stunningly large positive effects. Okay, so and when done well, the technology, what we've seen in some of our studies is I've seen bigger gains in 5 months than I've seen in other studies in 5 years. Okay, and the key to this is, if I may actually almost like make my own second question and say what is the most important finding I want to show you from the research. It's this one picture which I want everybody to focus on, and let me just share this. Okay, so if you can see this picture, okay, I consider this to be perhaps the most important picture to understand all of developing country education. And this is coming from a large-scale EdTech randomized controlled trial we're running in India. And what the picture on the left-hand side shows is the x-axis is the grade that the child is enrolled in. The y-axis is what is the true level of learning as assessed by a diagnostic assessment system. So that 45-degree line in blue is where you would expect the child to be if, in fact, they're making progress with the grade-appropriate curriculum. Now, there's 3 main insights in this picture. The first is that you'll see that the true level of learning is about half of what is in the curriculum. So that's that red line. And so kids are making progress as they go through the grades at roughly half the pace in the curriculum. The second, notice that the gap between where the kids are and where the curriculum is growing over time. So that by the time you're in 8th grade, the average kid is really at a 4th grade level in terms of math competence. And then the third, and I think the most important point here for education, not just for EdTech, but education more generally, is if you look at each dot in that picture, that's about 10 kids, okay? So what this is showing you is how much variation there is in learning levels of kids sitting inside the same classroom, okay? So in that 8th grade classroom, I've got kids at 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd grade level. And the teacher's task in a situation like this is humanly impossible. It doesn't matter how qualified you are, how trained you are, how motivated you are. There's just no way you're going to be able to handle kids spanning 6 different grades. And so what this highlights is both a challenge and an opportunity. And the other point I want to do in reflecting on this picture is most of my work is in India, but I've also worked in Indonesia, I've worked in Tanzania, and this is a feature of developing country education systems more broadly. And I want to come back to what Minister Dr. Tariq said, is that we tend to focus much more on the top end of the education system. So India is a great example where you have top technical education, top standards. But fundamentally, what you have is not an education system, but basically a filtration system, which is you have high-level exams and you're trying to see who are the kids who can pass these standards, who can then go on to higher education. But if you're not meeting those standards, the system pretty much abandons you. And that's because the instruction and the entire system is set up to be going lockstep with the curriculum. And are you able to pass these exams? Okay, so going back to what Dr. Tariq was saying, I think one of the most important mindset shifts we need in developing country education, perhaps globally, is to move from credentialing towards skilling and human development, which is how do I get every child to be learning, getting to full potential and improving relative to where you are. And so to me, the promise of technology is first and foremost measurement. Okay, so this picture is something that, Lan Pritchett, I remember in 2004, had drawn a schematic saying this is the picture we would like to have, but we've never had the ability to even have data to have this level of understanding. And that's because the technology is what allows you to have the granularity in the measurement, because I can give an 8th grade kid a test, and if you don't get it right, I can dynamically give you an easier question till I figure out exactly where you are, right? So the first promise of technology is just measurement. and having this visibility into the classroom to know what's actually going on in terms of learning levels. The second great advantage of opportunity is pedagogy, which others have talked about, and in particular, the customization, the ability to take the content to the level of the child and to be able to do this at scale, because that's what the technology lets you do. And the third, and I would argue almost the most important thing, and the one thing I'm concerned, which I've not heard anybody really talk about enough today, is the governance and the monitoring, right? Which is essentially what tons of my research are showing over the years, is that all the inputs in the world basically have very little impact unless combined with effective kind of monitoring and supervision and governance on the outcomes that we care about. Okay, so I have been to schools in India where you have well-equipped computer labs, that the computer lab is kept locked up because the teacher and head teacher is more concerned that the computer is going to be stolen than about effectively using it to teach. And that's because they're not being monitored on learning, they're being monitored on, was there any corruption in the procurement, or did the hardware get lost? Okay, so I think it's just really, really important when we make all of these investments to have clarity on what is the outcome we want, which is universal learning, and how do we make sure we're building systems to measure that and leveraging the technology to get us there. So let me stop there.
Interesting points, Kartik. But so if there's a fundamental issue, though, of the lack or insufficient monitoring, could you also say that there are actually, let's say, EdTech approaches out there that are more effective than we think, just simply because the data isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think so to me, what gets me so excited about technology is that when you look at the research of the past 20 years, the business as usual inputs for the most part have very modest effects, right? The big benefits come from governance and pedagogy. And technology, if done well, allows us to crack both of those problems at scale, right? So that picture I showed you shows you how the technology can get you pedagogy at scale. But the governance, what's exciting is I now have visibility on what every child is doing every single day. So yeah, I can actually monitor. And so in this project we're doing in Rajasthan, covering about 10,000 kids, we know for every single kid every day how many questions you've done and what progress you've made. And so that gives us a level of visibility into what's happening at child level learning outcomes, which I think can be a real game changer. The other place where technology gets me very excited is in improving the quality and use of administrative data for monitoring. So again, one of the kind of the unpleasant kind of realities is that a lot of education systems fudge their data. Okay, so, and even when you move a focus to learning outcomes, we've got this new study done by my colleague Abhijit Singh called The Myth of Official Measurement, where you kind of look at officially reported data on learning outcomes. And what he did was do this simple audit where we went and remeasured the same child and the same question about a month later. And you see that the true level of learning is about half of what is reported in the system. And this is without any formal incentives, right? And it's just because nobody likes to show that kids are not learning. And so one of the other things he did was then do a randomized controlled trial of using technology for measurement. And so all that they did was that they randomly selected a bunch of schools and used digital technology for measurement. And they found that the rate of data fudging essentially fell by 90%. And that's because now with the technology, you have real-time testing. You have a question bank, so you randomize which question is asked. You kind of have the immediate answer recorded and uploaded, so there's no time to change the answer. So it can also really, really improve governance and generating better data and visibility on what's happening at the last mile level. So I think, and this is not to say or kind of negate what's been said before, because in many ways, the technology, the broadband, the hardware, these are necessary. My caveat is that they're not sufficient. And so my main concern when I sit and see policy documents is how much of the focus on policy documents is budgets for procurement, budgets for infrastructure, and how little there is correspondingly for the monitoring of the outcomes, which is going to be essential if we are going to translate all of this spending into outcomes.
Great points. Just a final thing for you, Kartik, but then so you've talked about the importance of monitoring and support and so on, but just on the kind of the end user experience, shall we say, the services, I mean, are there a few that you've come across that do, at least if those wraparounds are there, show great promise in improving learning? What sort of approaches in tech seem to be delivering?
Yeah, so I think, so the promise, I remember being at a conference at Carnegie Mellon a couple of years ago where, the promise of EdTech is that it can it can get us improvements in so many different dimensions that if put together, you can really see where the game-changing effects come from, right? So what are these? The first is just the quality of the content that we know about. Second is the customization. The third is shortening the feedback loop between what a child does and the feedback you get. So today in a typical classroom, even a sincere teacher will grade a homework assignment and get it back in a couple of days, by which time the child's already forgotten why you wrote what you wrote. And so if you compress that feedback loop and saying, here's exactly why you got this right or why you got this wrong, that all the evidence from kind of just the cognitive science suggests that that's going to help in terms of learning and absorption. The other place for technology is in student motivation and engagement, right? So you kind of see the positive feedback loops that come from instant feedback that you're doing well, the benefits of competitions among kids. And so there's many, and then the other thing which I'm really excited about, and I was going to say this in the context of COVID, is the one great opportunity from COVID is that it is allowing us to really crack the household and seeing if we can intervene at the household level, right? So if you look at the famous Coleman report in the US back in the 1960s, so it was kind of pretty depressing, right? Because it was depressing because it said that 80% of long-term learning outcomes are determined by household factors, okay? And that's depressing because as policymakers, we can control schools and what we do with teachers and schools and buildings and training, but changing what's happening in the household was seen as something that's beyond what an education policymaker can do. Now what I think COVID is forcing us to do is to think about how do you reach kids in the household through mobile and other technologies. And my hope is those investments that we're making today in reaching the household will persist even when classrooms open. And that may give us some real upside in the long term from this otherwise kind of painful pandemic.
Thanks very much. We're going to move in a second to take a few questions specifically for Jaime and thinking about the bank's reports, but maybe just briefly turning back perhaps to the ministers in particular. You've got the new resource demands of new technology, both the content, the service providers, the telecoms infrastructure required. You've got those challenges of trying to refocus on more progressive learnings-based outcomes. You've got the pandemic, which of course is creating a huge disruption and economic shock. I mean, how on earth do you find the resources, and how do you prioritize between all of those different fires, if you like, in trying to improve learning outcomes? If Dr. Tariq?
Well, I'll answer that question, Omar, but I really like the comments by Professor Karthik. I just want to share with everybody our experience. Learning outcomes during the pandemic, while we used technology very heavily and actually worked very hard on customization and the quality, connecting it to the pedagogy, all the right things, but it really differs, the learning outcomes, depending on age groups. For example, for youngsters, they really need to go to school. They cannot depend on online learning fully or alone, no matter what we do. So we are very worried about the outcomes of learning for younger students. If we have to stay at home, yes, we are ready to do 100% online, but that wouldn't really achieve the results for the young ones. That's why in Egypt, we addressed homes directly, as Professor Karthik was contemplating, by making a TV channel for parents of young people. We are addressing the young people. We are assuming they are the teachers, telling them what to do at home if they have to do homeschooling. So there is a channel dedicated across the country for parents of children from KG1 to grade 3 alone. People in high school achieve better results with technology. They are able to study this way. But when it comes to cost of this whole operation, of course, the cost is astronomical, and we need to get access to everybody. We are talking millions and millions of kids. There is a cost no one mentioned, and it came about today in a cabinet meeting here in Egypt. Everybody is talking about the vaccine, and the vaccine is a prerequisite for people not to panic and to send their children to school. But we have to realize that this is a very expensive endeavor. If we want to vaccinate children and teachers so the panic goes away, that costs, we calculated it today, costs $500 million every 6 months to do that for our children. So I think this is a problem, a worldwide problem. So unless we find a solution for the cost of that, this crisis will stay for a long time and probably will affect learning poverty in an adverse way. So we are worried about the cost to just vaccinate our children and teachers to bring education back to normal at least. But that sounds prohibitive right now. But everything Professor Karthik mentioned, we are really looking at is absolutely right in many of these remarks. But in Egypt, we have achieved a lot of progress. When engaging parents are sitting, they're allowed to join virtual classrooms with their children. The television is the #1 technology picked up by parents grades 4 to 9. This is the most used thing across the country, and we really did some kind of new innovative TV classrooms. We have 3 channels working with the satellite or even antennas to cater to the poorest neighborhoods when they have no internet, nothing else. So it's very reliable. For high schoolers, we have invested in technology. They don't need that. They're doing well. We are testing millions of them from their homes next week. All of that is coming okay, but learning outcomes for the younger students are suffering, and we are trying to find a cure for that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I want to now turn back to Jaime and also encourage anyone watching to pose any additional questions to him. I mean, Jaime, I see there is one here for countries where the vast majority of children are not even able to read with understanding. Isn't the World Bank's proposed vision for the future of learning unrealistic?
I don't think so, because many countries have done it. I mean, what we need to do in terms of changing mindsets that Tarek has mentioned, many of the things that we need to do in terms of improving what's happening inside the classroom, which is something that Karthik explained, right? I mean, how do we foster that the teacher really cares about what's happening with all students within the classroom and not only the top? Many of those things are about changing the way we behave, right? And that requires some resources, yes, but it's something that is doable, right? Let me give you the example of the state of Ceará in Brazil, right? That went from being the municipality ranked 1200 to be the municipality ranked #1 within Brazil in less than 10 years, basically focusing on taking politics out of the classroom in the sense of saying, we're going to select and choose teachers meritocratically, and then give the teachers with the tools that they need in order to make sure that each one of the students will learn, and give realistic curriculums, right? And making sure that all teachers will focus on learning. And many of the teachers do, right? Many of the teachers internalize that their job is to make sure that each one of the child in the classroom will learn, but not all. And we need to make sure that all teachers have internalized that that's their role, because each teacher is in front of a set of students. So I don't think that that's something that is impossible. That's really not rocket science. Now, many of the systems that require monitoring, right, that require training teachers better, now really can be done with technology. So technology is really a huge hope, right? Now, it's not easy, right? It's about building a whole ecosystem. And I think my predecessors have mentioned very clearly that, I mean, we need to worry a lot about implementation. So I'm not saying that things are easy, but what I'm saying is that things are really possible, right? And then many countries have done it, but we have too many that haven't. A lot is about political commitment. So, and we think that it's doable.
And a final couple of questions around the homeschooling issue that has been raised earlier. So parents, some of them are switching to homeschool entirely or not sending their kids to school anymore. Is that a concern for the bank? And perhaps linked to that, if there's this wider advocacy for the role of home support beyond school, what policies does the bank and others need to encourage to fully embed that?
No, so thanks for that. But this is not about downplaying the role of the school, right? I mean, the school system and public school systems are the main mechanism to equalize opportunities that many countries have already experienced. Our emphasis here is that learning is a continuum, right? It's a continuous process. So in addition to all the investments that we need to do at school, right, and for the right learning to happen at school, we have to recognize that there are a lot of inequalities at home, right? And sometimes we see that, well, let's try to have schools taking care of it. That's not enough. We really need to worry that at home, children have the right materials and children have the right support. Hence, this type of intervention, like what Tarek was mentioning, right, of TV channels for parents or guides for parents, that has to be part of public policy. And that's the part that in many cases we have forgotten. So this is not about, the responsibilities on parents and it's not on teachers. What we're trying to say is that responsibilities is on both, right? It's on teachers, is on parents, is on the community as a whole. So we need to have strike the right balance of supporting the whole continuum of the learning process.
Okay, Jaime, I'm sorry to cut you off because we have got some more questions coming in and there's plenty more that we could discuss with the panel, but unfortunately time is getting very tight. So I'd like now to turn back to Mamta for a few reflections on what she's heard today and next steps. Mamta.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you very much to all the panelists and also to the participants for the great questions. It's a bit hard to come up with some coherent reflections, but let me do my best. The first thing I want to emphasize and what I heard is really on the role of preparation for school. I think Minister Creamer talked about this, the role of early childhood education. Karthik, you talked about this, the role of the resources that are brought to bear in the home for learning. And it's important for us not to forget that, even as we focus on school systems and teachers. My second reflection is really about school systems and teachers. And I think, Karthik, you described it very well when you talked about governance and pedagogy, right? And quite simply, the teacher is at the heart of the learning process. And we still live in a world where teachers are not meritocratically selected or promoted. I think it's important to make the point that if given they're so important to the process, this is something that needs to be done systematically everywhere. The reward, if you like, for teachers needs to be around the impact that they have through their instruction on student learning. And again, this seems like an obvious thing to say, but this is not systematically the case everywhere, that teachers are rewarded, if you like, for their impact on the learning of children. My third reflection is really on the technology point, and many of the panelists made this, that it's a great complement, it's a great support. It's actually expanding the horizon through which children can learn and be helped because of the huge range in learning outcomes that exists within a classroom. And so we really need to use technology to its full potential to complement and the teachers and to ensure high quality learning in the classroom. My fourth takeaway is really on this point of skills. And I think, Minister Tariq, you made this very well. We have to get beyond credentialing, right? Beyond diplomas and school leaving certificates and graduation certificates, and get onto this business of what is it that kids are learning, and and evaluating that and making sure that that's relevant for them to be good citizens, good parents, good workers, what have you. My next takeaway is really around school systems. School systems do need to be managed effectively, and there's a role for administrators. There's even a role for principals, school principals as leaders of the school. I heard less about that today, but I do feel that that's quite important if these visions that we have, are to be effectively implemented. And then my final reflection is really, it comes from what everyone said. I think the minister from Rwanda, Egypt, Ecuador, everybody talked about this, the political commitment, right? To really follow through on this very important endeavor that engages 75% of society. I was very struck by the number that Minister Tariq you gave. If you count teachers and parents, you're getting to a very large proportion of society. And the political commitment to make sure that this is that learning poverty, learning outcomes are addressed, to my mind, is a very important takeaway as well. So let me stop. A range of things that have come through this discussion, and I hope I've done justice to the key points. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Mamta. Thanks to your colleagues at the bank, of course, to the three ministers here, and to Kartik and Victoria. And thanks all to you for listening today. Obviously, we've heard huge challenges around the gaps in evidence, about the needs for evaluation and monitoring, about the huge role and pressures around funding and finance, as well as political will and commitment. But great to hear at least some ideas around focusing on learning, on outcomes and leadership and quality. So thank you very much indeed for participating, and very best wishes as you all work to try to improve the opportunities for our children and the coming generations. Goodbye.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I have video.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, now finally we can see
Bye,
you.
Mr. Krima.
Finally we can see you.
Finally.
Too late.